So in the last lecture, we got some basic styling for our form. We also fixed that error, though I will revisit that. Now let's find a way to create our form dynamically and to clearly define how each element should look like. For that, I'll have a look at the data I actually want to pass with the order. Get some customer data like the name and the address, and then we get this delivery method. This could be a drop-down where we can choose between fastest and cheapest or something like that. So for that, let's say we want to store or handle this form shape, basically, and all the element data in our state. There, we could have the order form property, which should be a JavaScript object. And in this JavaScript object, I now want to define all the form fields, so all the inputs, how they should be configured, and their values. So now I will grab my setup from down there with the customer and the delivery method, delete these fields from the order object for now, and add them to the order form. Now I want to flatten this so that I just have all the inputs I want to have. So I get rid of customer and of address, so of these nested properties here, so that now we just have some properties in the order form where each property represents one input I want to create. Now the goal is to also define how this input should look like so that we can really go through this object dynamically, that we could even add elements dynamically and create a fitting input element. For that, I want to have an element type property for each element, and this should be a normal input element. Here we should use normal HTML tags basically without the lower and greater than sign, just the tag name. Then let's say we want to have an element config, and the names of these properties are of course totally up to you. The element config here could define the configuration, the normal attributes we can set up for the chosen HTML tag. So here that could be a type, which should be text. We could set up the placeholder here too, which could be your name. This will in the end be what I want to distribute over the created input. And then let's say we also want to have a value for the name. The value here could simply be Maximilian, or of course an empty value at the beginning. And that's it for now. And this is a pattern I now want to repeat for all the elements. And you could of course write a bit leaner code. You could create a helper function which creates such a JavaScript object so that here you call just a function which initializes it. I'll write this in the long form to make it really clear what's happening here, even though that will bloat our class for the moment. So street should also be an input element, text, and then here I'll just input street, like this. Value could also be empty. The zip code, same game, input of type text. You could of course enter type number here, but maybe you want to leave the zip code as a text so that users can also enter zip codes with some characters in them somewhere where this would be necessary. So here I'll add zip code as a placeholder. The country, well, here you could of course use a drop-down, but I'll also use a text input here so that we can accept any country, because having a drop-down with restricted countries, implementing that is a bit more complex, and you would probably use some third-party package for that. And then the email, last but not least, here the type could be email, so the default HTML type email you can assign to an input, and here you can say your mail or email actually. So with that we get this set up. Now the delivery method should of course also get such an object. Here the element type, however, should be select, and there the element config should of course also have some elements, but not the type, not the placeholder. Here we could say we want to define the options we want to have. And options then of course should be an array, and there we could enter JavaScript objects again, where we have the value, that could be something like fastest, and the display value, which could be fastest like this. And of course, you can also fine tune this configuration to your exact needs. I'm just showing some examples here. So here we could then have, of course, a second option, which is cheapest. And here it's cheapest. So this could be my delivery method setup. So now we get this quite long order form with all the key value pairs where we have some identifiers of our different form elements basically, and then a JavaScript object with the configuration and setup. And now let's adjust our input element to, well, be able to work together with that so that we can then dynamically create these inputs by just looping through our, well, object here, which of course we have to transform in an array for that. But let's start by adjusting the input element. I'll do this in this lecture too. So there, we probably want to pass something like, let's have a look, like we want to pass the type and the config and the value. So we should do that. Let's remove type name placeholder here. Let's simply pass the element type here, which should be something, the element config, and we don't need to write this lowercase because I will change the way I distribute props on the created element. And then also the value, which is something. Of course, real values will be added soon. Then let's go into our input element, and in there, now we receive different props. We have the element type, where I still want to use my switch statement, but then I no longer distribute all props, I just distribute props, and there this element config property I just set up. So this property, which of course in the end should receive the element config setup for a given input in our state. And there, if we then distribute the props, these are the default HTML attribute names. And that is of course important that you use them inside element config, the default names. So with that, we got this set up, we got the input element adjusted here. Of course, I also want to add the value to each input element. So I will add in my input component, add the value property there and bind this to props value so that this is also received here. And now I'll simply wrap all these properties over multiple lines for the created elements so that it's a bit easier to understand and read. And with that, we got a input element, our custom input component, I should say, which hopefully works. In the next lecture, I now want to use our JavaScript form data we configured in the state to create the real input elements with it.